Okay, so good evening, CFP. Good to see all of you here. Welcome to the third lecture of Perspectives and Introduction to the Arts and Social Sciences. Today we have with us Sabeena Gadihoke. She teaches digital media arts, cinematography and photography studies at Jamia Millia Islamia. She's a documentary filmmaker, writer, curator, photo historian, and she's going to talk to us about Homai Vyarawalla, who was India's first woman press photographer. So Sabeena's written this book called Chronicles. It's in our library for whenever you come back to campus, and that's like a treasure trove of absolutely fantastic photographs. So if you want to, I think I definitely say go and borrow it from the library, read it. Okay, so as always, put any questions you might have in the Zoom chat box, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. So Sabeena, welcome to CFP, and thank you so much for being with us here this evening. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana. Can I be heard? Yeah? Okay, great. So thanks so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure always to speak to students. And I teach, of course, at Jamia, but it's always a pleasure to speak to younger students because it's nicer. So I don't know how, but it's just generally nicer. So I'm looking forward to a discussion after this talk. And what I'm going to try and do is make it as chatty as possible, even though I will be reading from time to time, because I was telling Diana that I don't want to go over time. But I will show it's going to be heavily illustrated. So I'm going to kind of probably disappear behind the photographs and let the photographs speak for themselves as I speak. We'll show a few clips in the middle, which Dhupika is going to help me with. And then we will have a conversation after this. So let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, can you see my full screen? Okay, so I'm going to start by describing a clip that I'm going to show you at the end. And it's a clip of, it was made with archival movie footage, and it was made on the morning of the August 15th, 1947, which is the day that India became independent. Of course, you know that there was this kind of, midnight ceremony. So on the 14th, the night of the 14th and the 15th. And the swearing-in ceremony of Nehru had just happened as the first prime minister of the country. And at the end of this, a guard of honor led the ceremonial carriage, which was carrying the Governor General, the first Governor, the first Governor General of India, who was Lord Mountbatten, and his wife down the road, so that people could kind of, cheer. And so people were cheering along the way. And as press photographers ran along with the carriage that was leaving Rashtrapati Bhavan, a woman in a white sari walked across the frame. She runs across the frame. I saw that in the archival film, and she's holding two cameras. And then you could almost miss that detail because it's a very tiny detail. You're going to see the clip right at the end. And it lasts for just a few seconds. And then the camera moves to the more famous protagonists of this moment of history. So you actually move then to the important people. And so you kind of almost miss her. And a few seconds later, she would take this photograph of the buggy ride with the Mountbattens, traveling through. And so in this talk, I'm going to pay tribute to this incredible woman who I was privileged to know for about 15 years, Homai Vyarawalla, who was India's first woman press photographer. And I knew her till she passed away, and she passed away at the age of 98 after celebrating her 98th birthday in December of 2011. And then she died a month later in January 2012. I first met her when I was making a film in 1997 called Three Women and a Camera, which had two younger women and Homai. And after making the film, I just felt that it just didn't do justice to her. So I went back to interview her every few months. And I then wrote a book on her. So this is Homai, of course, in her khadi sari. And I went ahead, as Diana just pointed out, I wrote this book called Chronicles of Homai Vyarawalla. And this book was written in 2006. I then went on to curate 4 exhibitions on her work. But this meeting with Homai was the beginning of a very long friendship. And I hope that through this talk, I'll also take you through some of those elements of that friendship. And as I said, I was privileged to have known this woman. And let's start at the beginning. So Homai belonged to the progressive but cosmopolitan Parsi community in India. She was born in 1913 in Navsari in Gujarat. And her father was an actor in a traveling Urdu Parsi theatre company. And they traveled all across, as a little girl, she traveled to Burma, to Malaysia, to different countries in Southeast Asia. So that's a photograph of her father, Dosa Bhai Hathiram. Her mother was a homemaker. And Homai loved acting, and she often told me that had she had a choice, she would have liked to be an actor. But in those days, women of good, respectable families didn't become actresses. So it's very different from the times today. And so after her father's premature death, she had to earn a living. She didn't belong to a very well-off family. And as it so happened, she made the right choice. And she learned photography from her boyfriend then, Maneksha Vyarawalla. So she was Homai Hathiram, he was Maneksha Vyarawalla. They went around for many years in Bombay and they shot photographs in Bombay. He was self-taught, he taught her. And some of her early hand-colored pictures, now this is a hand-colored picture in a magazine called the Bombay Chronicle. It was a newspaper. And she shot for this, but if you notice at the bottom right-hand corner, it says M.J. Vyarawalla. So her photographs were actually being credited to her boyfriend, who already was known to these pictorial magazines. So her first photographs never came under her own name, they came under the name of her boyfriend. And this period marks the first phase of her photography, where she went around in Bombay taking photographs. I keep calling it Bombay because that is what she used to call it. Of course, it's Mumbai now. And she created a reputation for herself. She married Maneksha in 1941. And in 1942, they moved to Delhi. And where she would photograph for over 3 decades. She was employed by the British Information Services that became the British High Commission after independence. This was a very important part of Indian history that spanned the last days of the British Empire, the transition to independence. Of course, there was the horror of partition and the euphoric early years of nation building, and then some amount of disillusionment with the nation state by the 1960s. But by then her photography was coming to an end, and in 1970, she gave up photography. Now, her new job in Delhi required her to photograph important people and cover major events. So I'm going to quickly run you through some of the significant photographs that she took. These are iconic pictures that we've learned to recognize, but perhaps some of us don't know that they were taken by Homai. So that, of course, is a picture of Homai photographing in Bombay. This is a photograph of Lord Mountbatten at the same event, just as he comes out after the swearing-in ceremony on the morning of August 15th, and he's surrounded by these jubilant crowds. That's Nehru on August 16th at Red Fort, Point. That's the first flag hoisting. So people often think that the first flag hoisting was on the 15th of August. It wasn't. Homai always corrected people. It was on the 16th because they were all tired on the morning of the 15th. They had just finished the midnight ceremony. So he's pointing out the crowds to Edwina Mountbatten, who was the wife of Lord Mountbatten at Red Fort. And this is Gandhi coming for a very important meeting that perhaps very few people know about, which was a meeting where members of the parliament, of the Congress committee voted for partition. So by a show of hands, they had to vote for the partition. It was what was called the 3rd June plan to partition the country. And you see Nehru in the photograph, you see Indira Gandhi at the back, you see Govind Ballabh Pant at the back, you see Rajendra Prasad, who became the first president of India. And these are people who, by a show of hands, were voting for partition. Of course, Homai was very disappointed with this. And you can see that lots of people were very disappointed. So that's Rajaji and Maulana Azad, who became the first education minister in independent India. And they're very, very dejected. This is Lord and Lady Mountbatten and their daughter Pamela and Rajkumari Amrit Kaur sitting on the grounds after the death of Gandhi. So she photographed the funeral of Gandhi. And so this is at the cremation ground. These are the crowds at the station running along with the train that was carrying the ashes of Gandhi to Sangam to be immersed in the river. And that's his son, his youngest son, Devdas Gandhi, with the urn carrying his ashes on the train. And this is, of course, crowds running along with the as the train moved through different towns, people ran along because they knew that Gandhi's ashes were being taken to be immersed in the river. That's Lord Mountbatten taking the salute for the last time as he left India in 1948. And that is the first Republic Day. Now, we like to think of Republic Day as we've all probably seen it on TV as at India Gate, but the first Republic Day was actually held at the Purana Killa, where you have the zoo in Delhi. And this was the very first Republic Day in 1950. You can see the background. You can see, the background of Purana Killa. And that's the first Republic Day taken at India Gate. And Homai climbed to the top of India Gate to take this photograph. Of course, now you're not allowed to climb there. And this is a fox hunt after independence. It's a very beautiful photograph. She really loved this picture. And that is the building of steel plants and dams, which was, part of independent India. So that's the Queen Elizabeth, visiting the Durgapur steel plant when she came in 1961 to India. And, she photographed a number of important people when they came to the country. So that's the famous civil liberties leader, American leader, Martin Luther King, and his wife, Coretta Scott King, with Nehru when he came to India. Justice Warren, who was the first Chief Justice of India, with his wife, Earl Warren, and it's a hand autographed, picture, which was given to Homai. And all these pictures carry stories. So, I mean, I'm not going to tell you all the stories, but maybe some I will. So while photographing them at Agra, she fell backwards. She was taking these photographs and she had all these adventures. She was always falling into water, falling down. So she fell backwards and she fell into the water. It was a very hot day. And later, Mrs. Warren came up to her and whispered in her ear and said, "I wish I could do that as well." Because, Homai had got completely drenched in the water. That's Queen Elizabeth, who comes in 1961. It's a beautiful photograph. You can see, the outer focus at the background, and you can see Homai in sharp focus. The Queen in sharp focus. And remember that she was the only woman photographing among many men. She was the only woman photographer at that time. So it's not surprising that many of her subjects turned to look at her directly. So you can see the Queen looking directly at the camera, at Homai's camera, because she's looking at this woman who's photographing in the middle of all these men. And this is Jacqueline Kennedy, who was popularly known as Jackie Kennedy, who was the wife of the very, who was a very favorite American president, John F. Kennedy. And she comes to India and she's sitting with Indira Gandhi. And of course, there's a story here as well, because one of Homai's photographer friends went to peek at why it was taking so long. So he saw Mrs. Kennedy sitting here and he said, "Abhi to unhone dhang ke kapde hi nahi pehne," which means that she isn't even properly dressed as yet. Because you have to remember that these were still conservative times. So he saw Jackie Kennedy wearing this little skirt and thought that she's probably not properly dressed as well. A very valuable history that Homai photographed for Time Life was the first crossing of the Dalai Lama, the first ever crossing of the Dalai Lama into India. So you see that this is the Dalai Lama. And remember that at this point, he did not wear the robes of the bhikshu, which he does now. So this is a very young Dalai Lama wearing, if you see it in color, there's a photograph in color at the, on the other side of the book. He's wearing these lovely brocade yellow clothes because he was like a prince. Now, he was coming to India to attend, this was 1956, with the Panchan Lama that you see at the back. And this was to attend a meet to celebrate 2,500 years of Buddhism in India. Now, it was an interesting moment because Zhou Enlai, who was the premier in China, was also visiting India at this time. And there was a lot of tension between the two of them because there was already a rumor that the Dalai Lama was planning to leave China. And so this is a rare photograph where you see Zhou Enlai, Nehru, and Dalai Lama, share the same, dais together. And there was, as I said, a lot of tension between them. And 3 years after these photographs were taken, and after the first photograph was taken in 1956, the Dalai Lama crosses over, he escapes into India. And of course, there's no camera to witness this crossing because now, of course, it has to be completely secret because he's taking political asylum in India. And then he stayed on in India. So this was the Dalai Lama later, a few years later. And of course, there was an irritation. I mean, there was a kind of tension with China. And in 1962, we fought our first war ever as independent India, which was a war with China. We were defeated. And, Nehru had to take a lot of blame for that. And he never really recovered from that, that debacle. And he died soon after in 1964. And here are some images taken by Homai of, so this is Nehru, an ailing Nehru with Sheikh Abdullah from Kashmir. And this is Nehru's funeral the procession passing through Connaught Place in Delhi. And then I'm going to just add 2 more pictures, which are pictures of Indira Gandhi with her husband, Feroz Gandhi, and Sanjay Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. Sanjay Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi is the grandfather of, Rajiv Gandhi is the father of Rahul Gandhi. And this is at the first Asian Games. So they were with their mother, and you have Indira and you have Rajiv and Sanjay. So this is when they were little. Now, let's talk a little bit about her relationship with her subjects. So these are pictures of Nehru, who was the first prime minister, who was very camera friendly and always her favorite subject. And you can see that he posed for photographs. I mean, he was, this is a candid picture. And at the same time, you can see that Nehru has deliberately gone and stood next to this board saying photography strictly prohibited at the airport. And Homai loved him because, he was so camera friendly that, she had a very close relationship with him. So I'm going to stop here and ask, so these are just a few more pictures. Nehru releasing a pigeon at the Asian Games. And of course, as I said, he was always performing for pictures. And let's see the first clip, which is about this particular photograph that was taken by Cartier-Bresson, Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was this very famous French photographer, contemporary of Homai. And Homai did not like this photograph. So let's look at why she didn't like this photograph. So Dhruvika is going to play us that clip.
Yes, you will stop screen sharing?
Yes, I will. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I don't like this sort of pictures.
Why don't you like
this? I know this was happening, but the cameraman should have avoided drawing their attention to himself. This is everybody wanting to look at the camera and take the picture when the picture was taken. Now these are all crowd pictures. This is a nice picture with a little touch of brightness that is very attractive. I don't like this picture at all because it makes our Prime Minister look more like a clown against these dignified people. After all, you have to show dignity in a person, not to make him look like a clown.
Okay, thanks, Dhruvika. I'm going to go back. Okay, so why didn't she like this photograph? She didn't like it because, sorry, I need to come back to the current slide. She didn't like it because she felt that it made the Prime Minister look more like a clown. Now, the question that you might ask is that if she's a press photographer, how does she then take candid pictures? And Homai did continue to take candid pictures. But for her, it was very important that she was unobtrusive, that she had a lot of patience, that she waited for the right moment, and she took the most brilliant candid pictures. But what you also see in this clip, which is slightly funny, but I think there's something serious about it, it's also talking about a woman who would not compromise the dignity of her subjects. For her, the dignity of her subjects mattered a lot. And it's very different from the kind of photography that you would see today, but you have to remember that these were different. This was a different moment where these were heroes for, the disillusionment with the nation state set in much, much later. But these were heroes for them. And she did not want Nehru to be in that compromised position. And let me give you one more example. She never publicly exhibited this photograph for many, many years because she felt that it looked like, and this is the Vietnamese premier, Ho Chi Minh, who had arrived in India. And you see Nehru gesture, he's moving his hand, but it looks like he's pulling his beard. So for many years, she did not actually exhibit this photograph because she felt that it compromised the position of Ho Chi Minh. And she showed it many, many years later. And in return, I think for this dignity and this kind of trust, because of this kind of, attitude that she had towards photography, her subjects trusted her to let them take them in very, very private moments, and they had no problems with that. So for instance, this is a picture. Now, Nehru was actually a chain smoker, but he never smoked in public. And this is again a rare picture because she's taken him smoking, lighting up a cigarette for Mrs. Simon, who was accompanying him, who was the wife of the Deputy High Commissioner to Britain. And they were traveling on this first flight of the Boeing jet in 1961. And so she's taken this picture of Nehru. Or for instance, this was one of her personal favorites of Nehru hugging his sister, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, at Palam Airport, where she had just come. She was the ambassador to Russia. And she always said that this was not about a prime minister hugging the Russian ambassador, but the Indian ambassador to Russia. But this was actually just a brother, the affection between a brother and a sister. And that's why she loved this photograph. Okay, now while her days were spent photographing political events, Homai inhabited a completely different world at night. This is when she would change her khadi sari for a silk sari. And she would be invited to all these parties which were thrown by expatriates at embassies or at, at the Gymkhana Club, which is this very elite club in Delhi. I say elite because after independence, it was always a club where only the British were allowed. And after independence, they only allowed high-ranking officials of the civil service or army officers to be part of the club. So this is a dance at the Marina Hotel. These are people letting their hair down. Different kinds of, and you can see what a brilliant photographer she was to be able to capture this kind of, it's a moment and it's in the middle of action, and she's been able to capture the jump without almost any kind of blur. These were games at the Delhi Gymkhana Club, at embassies, fancy dress parties where people could be somebody else. And you can see in this picture, for instance, it's a strange picture because it's got Santa Claus giving an award to a British child who's dressed up as Lord Hanuman. So, all kinds of very interesting pictures that come out of this. And of course, many of them wanted her to come and take pictures at home. They wanted her to take pictures of them at Christmas so that they could send them home. Pictures of the kind of palatial homes in which they lived. These are Britishers who were living in India, so that they could carry these pictures back home to show people back home. And they wrote her letters, personal letters, telling her, this was the wife of the American ambassador, thanking her. And, so it was a different kind of moment. And they hoped to see her at the airport when they were leaving. So she had a kind of personal relationship with them. She also took scores of pictures of ordinary Indians. So just in case you think that she was only photographing the elite, she also took scores of pictures of ordinary Indians at birthday parties, school functions, marriages, all kinds of functions. And she continued to photograph till 1970. And she documented Delhi as roads were renamed and colonial statues were removed. So this is a picture that perhaps all of you might be familiar with because something important happened here some time ago. There was a hologram of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose that was actually, projected in the Chhatri at India Gate, the great Chhatri at India Gate, the canopy. But very few people know that this, at one point of time, in 1936, after the death of the father of Queen Elizabeth I, had a statue of George V. And this statue was removed soon after independence. So now, of course, it had the hologram, and then it will now have a statue, a granite statue of Netaji. And of course, Homai was very opposed to this whole idea of renaming and changing, because she felt that it actually completely changed history. And she said that why do we need to change history? Why do we need to rename roads? And why do we need to have statues replace other kinds of statues? After all, this is also a part of our history. So by the end of Homai's career, her presence was so significant that when the Home Minister Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel sent out an advertisement for photographers to join the newly formed Press Information Bureau, he added 2 words, women eligible. And that was all because of only Homai, because she was the only woman press photographer, but he added these 2 words because it was kind of assumed that people who would join the Press Information Bureau would be men. And so he added these 2 words. And after the death of her partner in 1969, Maneksha died in 69, she gave up photography. And after being a professional working woman for almost 33 years, she slipped with absolute ease to being a homemaker. She set up home for her only child in the small town of Pilani in Rajasthan. And she was absolutely forgotten for 23 years, till a photographer was looking through a list of names of Press Information Bureau photographers, and he noticed the name of a Mrs. Homai Vyarawalla there. And that's how he landed up at her doorstep. Satish Sharma was his name. And he organized the first exhibition of her work. And I met her a few years later in 1997. Now, the year that I met Homai in 1997 was the commemorative year. It was a very important commemorative year because it marked 50 years of India's independence. And so suddenly everybody was asking for Homai's photographs. She was being featured in every magazine. She was being interviewed, and she was suddenly famous all over again. And there was also the novelty of rediscovering Homai as a woman photographer. So if I were to talk about my own work as a researcher, I would say that this period marked my interest in Homai as rediscovering her as a woman, as a pioneering woman. And some of my early work was also driven by this whole idea of first. So, the first woman photographer, the first photographer to work as a woman in an arena which was dominated by men, and to photograph in an arena that was dominated by men. Because remember, except for Mrs. Gandhi, all the political figures at this time were men. So I'm going to now show you a clip from the film, which I made 1997, where you see, and also a woman who was actually engaging with technology, because she knew technology so well. So let's watch this second clip, and I'm going to stop screen sharing and ask Dhuvika to share the clip where you see her demonstrate the use of her camera, which was a speed graphic camera. So I'm going to stop share and let Dhuvika come here.
Holding the camera like this, I can keep both my eyes open and just look through like that. So I can see whatever is happening in that particular frame, at the same time what is happening around me. Then this is another viewfinder which I can use, which shows only the framing of the picture. And the focusing is done here, just like that, forward and backwards. So all in a hurry, I had just to shift this, take the picture, without any bother about focusing. And my pictures always used to come out proper focus. And after every shot, had to open this, remove the bulb, put it back, put another one. And I used to carry my camera like this on my shoulder, always. So this used to become the ashtray for the people, more or less.
Thanks, Dhuvika. I'm going to go back to share screen.
Please, could you use full screen for the photographs?
Is it not on full screen? I'm so sorry. You should have told me. I'm so sorry about that. Just a minute.
Thank you.
Has it come to full screen?
Yes.
Okay, it's again shifted. Sorry. Okay. So we've just seen that clip. So I met her at this time. And of course, I just wanted to say that you saw the whole engagement with this big, heavy camera. Now, just compare this to the kind of camera that you have now, where it's so easy to take pictures. And the other thing is, remember that this camera used only 12 frames. It had only 12 frames in one roll of film. So imagine how difficult it would be to take pictures, because you have to very, very carefully compose your pictures to get good pictures. And how different, think about how different it is. And maybe we can discuss this later, from an age when we can just endlessly click pictures and we don't even have to worry about editing. So it made for a much slower kind of photography, a much more deliberate form of photography. But did it make her pictures any less kind of skilled? That's something we should discuss, because think of how hard it was to actually take these pictures. Now, the film was only a beginning of a kind of a very long association with Homai. By now, she was living in Baroda. Tragically, her son had died at the age of 40. He had cancer. And I would travel every few months to Baroda to research the book. But I also, and she would, of course, write these beautiful letters to me in her handwriting, where she would insist that I write back to her in handwritten letters, and I could never do that. So she always used to get very irritated with me because I would write back on the computer, because I was too scared to show her how badly I wrote and how bad my handwriting was. And as my friendship with Homai grew over the years, I realized that she could do almost everything. She had always developed and printed her own photographs. She could build her furniture. She could stitch her own clothes. She did electrical and plumbing jobs on her own. She drove a car. She created nifty household gadgets. And she kept all her tools in a wooden chest of drawers. She also kept her negatives there. We'll come back to the chest of drawers. She often said that she was like Robinson Crusoe. Her island was her home in Baroda, where she lived independently with her plants and her photographs. Now, in 2010, which marks a new phase of her photography, she decides to give all her collection to the Alkazi collection of photography, which is a very major archive in Delhi. And these are pictures of her stuff being, kind of packed to go. But you see that chest of drawers at the back. Now, we started to digitize this chest of drawers because we had only seen what Homai had considered to be her best pictures. And when we started to digitize that collection, it was almost like a new facet of Homai that was opening up to us, because this entire collection of negatives that we saw in the chest of drawers, we had never actually seen it. But now with digitization, we could actually open that up. And as we started to began to have exhibitions of her work, and as the exhibitions moved from Delhi to Bombay and to Bangalore, and these are some pictures of the exhibitions this is at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Bombay, setting up the exhibition. As we moved, the space that we gave to what Homai considered to be her important pictures began to change. And other pictures of everyday life, mostly pictures that she had taken in Bombay in the late 1930s and early 1940s, began to become more important. So let me take you through some of them. There were these quieter moments in the city in Bombay. And these were very different from the pictures that she had taken of politicians as a press photographer. So you realize that she had been a very good street photographer as well. So that's the Gateway of India in Bombay, monsoon. Landscape. Streets and cities. This is Delhi. That the earlier one was Bombay. I also began to revisit many of the photographs that I had used in my book. Now, in my book, I had framed them very differently. So I also want to draw attention to the fact that as a researcher, sometimes you begin to look at things again with new eyes. So the thing is that I had always talked about, she had done a feature on, let's say, the radio. But when I looked at these individual photographs, they were very beautiful photographs, because I was looking at pictures that she may not have chosen to print up. And these for me became like histories of technology. So here is a picture where this man is kind of, putting together a radio, or, how to tell the weather. There were pictures where they were just having fun. So this is a picture of her husband, Maniksha, kind of they're shooting a medical kind of a setup, and he's kind of looking back at her, and they're obviously shooting photographs of each other. Now, this was at the end of an entire feature of nurses, but she had never shown this picture. But I just discovered this beautiful picture of a young woman, putting on her lipstick. And she was obviously a nurse. And this is after she's finished her day as a nurse. And I just thought that this was a lovely picture. It became the cover of a poster for an exhibition that I curated. So I was discovering all kinds of new work. There were lots of pictures of fashion shows, costume shows, what are called Brides of India shows. Now, Brides of India shows were a very popular form of entertainment in the 1950s. This is a photograph from Delhi. You always had a map of India in the background. And it was something that Nehru had coined, this term called unity in diversity, where you were different parts of the country, but you were actually part of the same country. But I began to look at these pictures and wonder how much the women seem to enjoy dressing up, how much they seem to enjoy, fashion, dressing up. And so you see all these pictures of fashion shows in Delhi, just at ordinary events where women were dressing up. And they're very different from the kind of fashion shows that we know of. You see a dog walking past. It's a very ordinary kind of a setting. The dog is wearing something made of the same material as the owner. And you had all these women kind of masquerading as being Indian. Some of them were not Indian. And yet the imprint of Nehru was very strong. So you see these two little American children dressed in Nehru suits and this woman wearing a khadi sari. And what I'm trying to say is that it gave me a new way of looking at the Nehruvian era, which is the era dominated by Nehru. Of course, the Nehruvian era is also used for a period just after Nehru died. But it also gave me an insight into looking at a Nehruvian era, not just through the lens of politics and political events, but also through cultural life. Okay, then there were histories of institutions. So in my book, I had talked about the history of the JJ School of Arts, where Homai studied, which is in Bombay, and the Lady Irwin College, where women trained to be good homemakers. So these were pictures of Lady Irwin College. But when I looked at the entire lot of negatives, I found at the end of the negative jackets, I found these incredibly interesting pictures where the women had actually asked Homai to be photographed by her. So they had finished with all the official pictures that they were to take. And now they wanted to pose for her in all kinds of ways. And it was very interesting that these pictures were being created because they were totally at ease. But these more playful pictures were being created because of the kind of chemistry or the kind of energy between the woman photographer and the subjects. So here are some pictures where they just wanted to be, they just wanted to show their legs, or they just wanted to show their hands. And it reminded me of this incident in Calcutta where there was this woman, this lady that you see right in the front. Her name was Bachu Balsara. An elderly lady walked up to me at an exhibition and she said, you know, that's me in the picture. But her memories of this picture were not to do with the air raid precaution measures that they were actually shooting, which was, you know, basically training for the war, for the Second World War, where they were training how to, you know, do medical stuff, how to take a body on a stretcher. But she remembered only the fun and games. And it gave me an insight into the kind of energy that Homai had with all these women and what her photographs of official events would finally kind of segue into other kinds of things. So you see a few more pictures like that. And of these young kind of modern girls. So for instance, this woman, Rehana Mughal, was a very, you know, a close friend of hers. And at this time, you have to remember that the modern girl was a college-going young woman. So this is an image of Rehana Mughal where she's, you know, posing like, you know, as if she's, you know, Cleopatra. I mean, that's what Homai told me. Or for instance, you know, she's at the JJ School of Arts. And this is a very interesting picture because it's two women who are actually making a portrait of this sculpture of this man. And it's the man who's, you know, being looked at by the women rather than the other way around. So this is at the JJ School of Arts. And again, it's a picture, there's a picture, you know, Rehana is on the left-hand side. And there were other kinds of images. So for instance, if fashion was one of the markers of the modern girl, then, or, you know, fashion and performance was one part of being a modern girl, then mobility and the ability to travel was another. So these are pictures of women travelers at the Mole Station. It was called the Mole Station, which was at the dockyard located behind Ballad Pier in Bombay. And they wear dresses and high-heeled shoes and hats. And many of them are looking back at Homai with a slightly distrustful kind of a look, you know, so they don't know her, they don't know who this woman is. And many of them may have belonged to the Anglo-Indian community, who with the arrival of independence in 1947 was increasingly isolated because they were considered outsiders by both the Indians and the British. So here are some pictures of these women at the station just outside. And when I look at these photographs of young women taken in the 1940s, I have to say that I always imagine and wonder what their lives would have been after this. And if their onward journey was interrupted by larger events over which they had little control. So it's almost like a speculation because I know very little about these women, but I wonder that, you know, it captures these fleeting moments of leisure. They're very beautiful photographs and, you know, these very carefree moments. So young girls, for instance, swing from banyan trees in abandon, or you have them, you know, putting their legs in water at a picnic, or, you know, a woman sketching, or, you know, the camera captures a private reverie as this young girl lies on her back with her eyes half shut under the open sky. And to my mind, these images represent what might have been possibilities of their lives. And I always wonder what happened to these women. Were they domesticated by marriage? You know, what happened when India becomes independent? Because when India becomes independent, feminist historians have talked about how the woman's question becomes kind of secondary to the political question, and women have to be more Indian in a sense. So what happens to these modern girls? And my guess is that modern girls were part of every era. And maybe with the coming of independence, the modern girl had to pretend to be good girls. So for instance, if you look at this picture of Rehana Mughal, which is a hand-colored picture, you see a tear. It's called a silent tear, and you see a tear under her eye. But beneath that covered head, which of course has to be now, independence is coming and she has to look more Indian, you can see the crinkled hair, the fashionably crinkled hair, you can see her lipstick, she's got makeup on. And so she's still, you know, the kind of modern girl that she actually is. And in a very interesting parallel, perhaps we need to now look back at Homai herself, because remember that Homai came from the very, she came from a community that was very liberal, which was very cosmopolitan, which was the Parsi community. She wore dresses. But when she comes to Delhi, she has to now start to wear a salwar kameez and a sari. And she deliberately chooses to wear a sari and a salwar kameez. And I would say that, I would argue that there were pressures of being the only woman in a man's world. She had to survive in a man's world. And it may have happened by accident, but one of her photographer colleagues, who was actually older than her, started calling her mummy as a kind of a joke. And she says that she actually welcomed this term mummy because she says it kind of put her on a pedestal and she hinted that it kept her safe. So I would say that she deliberately cultivated this persona of wearing a sari, a kind of a morally correct persona at work, because it provided her with an alibi to be able to do the most transgressive things that she was doing. Remember that she's this sole woman working with so many men. She's traveling all over the country on her own. And this perhaps, as I said, performing a certain kind of femininity is important to her survival as a professional, as a press photographer at this time. Now, I come to towards the end of my talk. I would like to talk a little bit, how are we doing for time? I have another, okay, I should take is it okay, Diana, if I take another 5 or 6 minutes or maybe 7 minutes?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so as a researcher, who I think will always work on Homai, I think that I'd always be a student studying Homai Vyarawalla in a sense. As a researcher, what changes for me and what direction will my work take? So one, of course, is that we are coming up with a new book now, and the book will actually be an edited collection of essays on this brief period of 5 years where I see her work being very different from her work as a press photographer. But one of the most significant changes is the fact that I don't have access to Homai's memory any longer. I cannot, ask her any details. And so, here, of course, is another picture where she's with all the men. But I keep going back to my interviews with her. Now, one very big gap in Homai's work, or absence rather in her work, is the partition. She never took photographs of the partition. But we also know that photographs are not only always about evidence. Photographs carry stories within that lie beyond the frames of the photograph. Now, this photograph always made her think of something else. It made her think of the partition and of a story to do with partition. And I'm going to quickly go over that. During the weeks and months of violence in Delhi, Homai and her husband would stand chatting on the terrace of their home in Connaught Place. So she lived right on the right edge. And so that wandering mobs would not set fire to the shop of their landlord below, who was Muslim. One night, a wealthy Hindu family arrived from Karachi and forcibly occupied the house. Her landlord's family fled to the camps at Purana Killa and never returned after that. Homai often spoke about this picture taken a few years after partition as haunted with nostalgia for what were better times and haunted by that loss. So it's a photograph that actually prompted a memory of partition for her, even though she didn't actually photograph partition. The other thing that I miss is her physical presence, because there are so many photographs for which I now have no kind of context. So let me show you this set of photographs where you have a man dressing up to become a woman. And it's part of a series. And here's the entire series. So you see that right from the beginning, right to the end, where he becomes a woman. Now, I don't have any details about this photograph. I don't know who this person is. But what I can do is speculate as a curator. So I can speculate that because Homai's father was an actor in a Parsi Urdu theatre company, perhaps this was someone known to her father. But that's all I can say about the photograph. But what is also interesting is how showing these photographs in a contemporary context gives you different kinds of layers. So when we showed these photographs, this was at a time when LGBTQ rights were becoming a very big thing. And so these photographs acquired a different kind of resonance when we were exhibiting them. And of course, I would never have been able to, as I said, talk about the modern girl and all those pictures, those post pictures of those young girls, had I not gone back to those negative jackets that actually had these photographs of the JJ School of Arts or Lady Urban College. But as I say that, I often say, people say, oh, wow, digitization created all of that. And I always say it's not just digitization. While digitization gives you many more, a lot more access to the photographs, it allows you to zoom into the pictures, it allows you to see small details in the photographs. A lot of my insights after Homai's death have come to me after I've gone back to analog archives. So I've gone back to paper archives. I've gone back to publications where Homai's photographs were first seen. So I came across this tabloid called Current, where Homai would photograph politicians very differently. So, she's talked about the dignity of the subject, but she'd often take these pictures where politicians were caught in kind of funny moments, and that was shown in the tabloid. So it gives me a different kind of an insight into her work. And so this actually makes me change my take on Homai as somebody, the changing contours of her archive gives us different ways in which we can look at Homai, not just as a pioneering press photographer from the 1940s, as she was viewed initially, but as a mobile and modern young woman herself, who was a keen chronicler of the public life of the cosmopolitan life in cities of Delhi and Bombay, prior to becoming a photojournalist. And so in this sense, Homai's photographs will always have several lives. and new interpretations that we may not actually agree with. So let me quickly show you this picture. This I took from the internet. Now, you know that there has been a rise of right-wing discourses around Nehru, and he's been attacked for all kinds of things. So this is one of those collages made by somebody where they've put together this collage of Nehru with different kinds of women, with different women, and, to kind of indict him as somebody who was morally kind of not quite okay, etc. But what is so ridiculous about it is that they've taken photographs out of context. And so among the many women you see there are Pamela Mountbatten, who he treated almost like a daughter, and his sister, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, right at the top of the picture, where, she's also been put there as a woman that he was probably having an affair with. So, these are kind of, taken out of context, but you can't do anything about that. That's what the internet does. And so these are different ways over which we will never have control over the ways in which Homai's photographs are being used. Now, let me come to the end of Homai's life. When we returned from the last of our shows, there was a request waiting for Homai to come to New York from a museum in New York. Would she be willing to travel to New York in July 2012? And the answer that she sent me on SMS read, remember that this is not the era of the smartphone as yet. And she says, "Dear Sabeena, so sorry for the late reply. Yes to New York trip if they arrange for both of us. Life is getting to be more difficult with passing days. Would love to escape." And warm hug. In her 90s, Homai had learned how to use a mobile phone and to send text messages, as she was hard of hearing. Now, we had already made a trip abroad in 2008 when she had traveled with me it was her first ever trip abroad. And we had traveled across the Atlantic. We had first gone to Chicago, then we had gone to Boston, and then we had come to London. And you'll see some of that footage because I kept shooting her on a moving camera in the clip that I'm going to show to you. And now she was ready to do it again, but sadly that was not to be. So my last meeting with Homai, actually not the last meeting because I was with her when she passed away. The 9th of December 2011 was her 98th birthday. It was the first time I decided to give her a surprise, and I landed up at her house. And it will remain one of the loveliest days that I ever spent with her. I gave her this lamp and she posed with this lamp. And the next day she gave me a very interesting interview. I was filming her the next morning, and she said her body was like a disobedient and ailing body that she described as a broken house. And she said, but the person who lives in it is still very young. And this interview has special resonance for me because you have to remember that I knew two Homais. I met Homai when she was an older woman, but she was forever young at heart. But she had given me so many insights into her past through her interviews, through writing and filming, that I also knew her younger self. So today I carry forward the memory of this extraordinary and forever young Homai, the woman who captured history through her photographs, but also created history as she ran across the frame of an archival film with her cameras. I'm going to end with this 3-minute clip, which I'm going to ask Dhruvika to show us, which I made as a tribute to her after she passed away. It has, as I said, footage from our trip abroad, but you'll also see the archival clip that I mentioned at the end, and then we will have a discussion after this. Thank you. So Dhruvika, I'm going to stop sharing so that you can show the clip. So I did want to say that the clip is actually, because you're going to put it up on YouTube, it's actually stolen. I just consider it to be my clip. So it's actually from this archival film, and I've just taken it out and used it without permission. But I don't think that should be a problem. It's your own YouTube channel, right? Yeah.
Okay, so guys, please put your questions here in the chat. Sabeena, you're such a fantastic storyteller. I mean, when you said if you could take 7 minutes more, I was like, take half an hour more. But then I figured people would have trouble with that. So there's such a sense of, everything changes, but everything stays the same in the photos that you have shown. It's just beautiful. So guys, please put all your questions here in the chat box, and we'll have a discussion. Or even just if you have.
Yeah, you can just say something if you want to.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering whether, because if you remember, I had talked about the 12 frames, and I was just thinking that, how do you people feel? Because we photograph incessantly now. And, it's a different moment. It's all these analog photographers who, you see, after a while, after the 12 frames, you had 36 exposures. So things moved. So the roll film that I know of was 36 exposures. But even then, think about it, 36, and then you have to change your roll. This is 12. So you have to shoot very carefully. You have to compose very carefully. And remember that film is very expensive. It's not like, it's not digital. Processing is very difficult. So it makes for a slower form of photography, but it also makes for, to my mind, a very deliberate form of photography that is where you have to be very economical because you can't afford to mess up your frame. And therefore, you take better pictures. So something to think about. Come on, guys, you can ask me something, anything. Anything that you want to ask me about the photographs or something about Homai. I mean, I have so much to tell you, but the thing is that, of course, we had to keep it limited.
I have a direct message. So we have a student asking, what did Homai think about everyone having cameras now and photography being?
That's an interesting question. So she never, ever picked up the camera again. Now that's something interesting, that she gives up photography in 1970. She says, I capped my lens, and capping meant capped. People would say, Mrs. Vyarawalla, can you just, I called her Mrs. Vyarawalla. I can call her Homai now, but I could never say Homai to her. So I would say, Mrs. Vyarawalla, do you want to try my camera? And she'd say, no. What is this? And she'd look at it with interest, but she'd never, ever want to take pictures. So I can tell you one incident for whoever's asked the question. And that is that Homai got the Padma Shri, the award from the president. It was Pratima Patil. And so we went to Rashtrapati Bhavan, and it was a lovely visit because she had to go in it was a lot. We had to really walk in. So she had a wheelchair and I accompanied her. And at the end of the ceremony, all the award winners had to be photographed with the president. So, they have a kind of a photo op. And there was this one woman photographer, Shipra Das. I know her very well because she's a photographer with India Today. And she, I have to say that press photography has not changed. Women do not choose to be in the world of press photography. It's a very rough and tumble world. And somehow women don't, we now have many more women who are camera people in the TV industry, or news, but women choose for some reason, even now there are very few women press photographers. So Shipra was kind of pushing and shoving and everybody, and of course it was a different moment. Remember, she's photographing at a moment when there are less people. Now there are so many photographers and, everybody was kind of edging everybody out. So when she came after the photograph, she looked at me and she said, I'm really glad I don't photograph now. So she saw this woman struggling and she said, look at the way they were pushing her. I'm really glad that I belong to a different moment. And she actually called them gentlemen photographers. That's because she came from a moment when there was a certain kind of courtesy to each other. She knew there were fewer people, they knew each other. And she gave up photography also because she felt a lot of people were coming in who were very, rough, and she didn't really appreciate that. I saw another question before this one, before Aryan's question, who says, how were you able to meet her? I'll come to that, but I think there was another one about my favorite Is it my favorite picture of Homai? I'm just... Dinah, can you read it out to me? Or should I just open up the chat box? 1 minute. Yeah.
Okay, Sabeena, can I stop you there? Because we have a whole bunch of questions.
Okay.
Everyone's decided to ask questions.
Okay.
So
maybe you want to combine them, Dinah. You might.
I'm just going to go over the questions one after the other, so we can take that in sequence.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Lakshita is asking, how were photographs colored by hand, and what kind of skill did that require?
Okay, so should I answer that first? Okay, so hand coloring was a process. It was not something that you could do through a printer. Hand coloring was actually physically hand coloring. So the art director in the magazine would actually color the photograph, tint it with hand, and then that got printed many times over. So that was what hand coloring was. Because remember, color photography arrives in the 50s in India. So we are talking about the 1940s, where you don't have color photography in magazines, but you have hand colored pictures.
Okay, 1 second. Aditya says, I always had a mindset that every shot counts, but it's been difficult for me to just take a perfect shot. And this archive gave me more inspiration to stay vigilant for it. What, according to you, helps to take such shots?
Okay, give me a second. I need to plug in my battery. So give me just 1 second. My power cable. Just give me 1 minute.
You all can text everyone that is enabled. I think you were only able to send direct messages earlier.
Okay. So the question was about, Dinah, can you just ask the question part again? I know what she said.
What, according to you, helps to take such shots?
Gosh, that's a tough question. Is that Aditya? Aditya, that's a tough question. I mean, I do believe that we all do this. We just click endlessly. And I think we forget to think about what we're doing. We forget to compose because we're so sure that I can pick the best one out. My question to all of us is, do we ever pick the best one out? I mean, we put one on WhatsApp, but do we erase the rest? I don't. And I just clog up my phone after a while. So I think it is important. I mean, as a teacher, I would say, as somebody who's into pedagogy, I would say that it's important to compose and to think about what you're photographing and why you're photographing, and to take limited pictures because it helps you think. I think photographs are not just about technique. Photographs are about your imagination. And I think it's important to think about that and to think about what you're taking.
Okay, this is from Lakshita. Do you think there was any change in the subject's candidness while being photographed by the one and only Homai Vyarawalla?
Look, this was a moment, and I always say this to people, candid photography takes some time to come. So even now, what we consider to be candid pictures are carefully posed pictures. This is not the moment. The real moment of candid photography comes a little later, when it's possible to click endlessly. So yes, she's taking candid pictures, but remember that even the candid photograph by the press photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson, the French photographer, used this term called the decisive moment. He said he would wait for that moment when all the elements came together and he'd click his pictures. Now, what is a decisive moment? When you're saying that you're waiting for that moment when all the elements of the picture come together, we're also talking about a more deliberated form of photography, where everything's coming together and you're waiting. So it's not absolutely candid. So coming back to Homai's pictures, I think that she is taking candid pictures, and at the same time, they are very carefully composed. She's thinking about how she's composing them. So even with the women, the pictures where the women are posing for, those are very, very staged photographs. The women want to pose in particular kinds of ways. They want to appear like models and fashion, film stars. They want to appear, with their heads thrown back. These are not candid pictures. These are very carefully composed, posed pictures.
Okay, this is a combination of two questions. That as a female photographer, what kind of challenges she faced, and did she face discrimination?
Okay, so she didn't consider herself ever to have faced any kind of discrimination. But, my suspicion is that it's also got to do with who she was and where she came from. She was from the Parsi community. The Parsi community was an extremely cosmopolitan, I hesitate to use the word westernized, but I would say cosmopolitan community, right? And so there was already a certain amount of freedom that she had. I mean, think of the fact that for so many years, she went out with her boyfriend, and, her mother was a widow, and she let her go, and she'd travel all over. She'd sometimes go to Navsari, come back. So obviously she came from a family, even though they were not a rich family, they were not an elite family, and yet she came from a family that was liberal. And of course, it was a priestly family. Her mother, the background was a priestly, they were a family of priests. But as far as Homai's own life as a press photographer was concerned, they were her friends. There were fewer people. She would never say that she ever faced any discrimination. I mean, she was very, very highly respected. And as I said to you, she was put on a pedestal by all these men. They had a friendly relationship. And she says in my film, she says, if anybody tried to do any hanky-panky, these are her exact words. If anybody tried to do some hanky-panky with me, I gave him a good bang on his head, and that was that. So she was a kind of a no-nonsense person, if you knew her. And that's how she dealt with everybody around. And remember that she had a lot of attention from her subjects. So Nehru, Rajaji, Rajendra Prasad, everybody knew her as Mrs. Vyarawalla or Homai. So I remember she once told me that, there was this very kind of crotchety politician who she had asked him to put his legs in the group photograph. And he got very irritated with her. So she was kind of walking out, and Nehru walked up to her and he says, why was he losing his temper? He says, why do you think about all this? Admire the view ahead. And he put his arm around her and they went for a walk. Now, can you imagine a prime minister doing that today? But those were different moments. It was a different moment. These were different times.
Okay, there are a couple of students who want to know what your first meeting with Homai was like and how you got so close.
I'd love to tell you that. Okay. So 1997, I'm making a film about 3 women photographers. I got a commission from Doordarshan at that time. And I decide to have I decide to have Shiba Chachi, who's an artist, Dayanita Singh, who's a very famous photographer now. And I mean, both Shiba and Dayanita are very well known. And I decided that I'll have a fashion photographer. And I was looking at the news, and on NDTV, they carried a story on her. It's just one of those chance things. I never knew about Homai. And I started to find out more, and I somehow found a connection to Satish Sharma, who had done that first exhibition. I knew his wife, and I landed up at his house, and he gave me her address, and she didn't have a phone. So think of how long it took. I wrote a letter on an Indian letter to her saying, I'm making a film. Can I come and meet you? She says, yes, you can come. I get a written letter back from her. So we are corresponding by letter. I get a letter back from her saying, yes, you come to Baroda. I take a train. I couldn't afford a flight in those days. I took a train to Baroda, landed up at her house, booked myself in a hotel, landed up at her house. I still remember I stayed in. I loved her cooking. So there was fish curry and there was dhan saag, and I'm a foodie. And, she loved the fact that I ate everything. I polished off the food. And so she invited me the next day for lunch. I stayed for 2 days, and she talked and talked and talked and talked. She lived on her own and she loved talking. I mean, there were days, she said, when her voice would get sore because she hadn't spoken to anybody in days. And then suddenly when she spoke to people, her voice would kind of crack up because she hadn't spoken to anyone, because she lived on her own. And she was 84 when I met her. And I was fascinated by her life because, as I told you, she was like Robinson Crusoe. There was nothing that Homai Vyarawalla couldn't do. In her bag, I remember that we went to the US. And of course, she was very critical of the kind of amount of food that was served in the US because, we got our breakfast and it had this big, kind of, juice and she said, how can you have so much of food? And everything was pushed onto me. You finish it, because she was a Gandhian. She hated wasting food. So she pushed it on towards me and I would have to finish everything. And by the end of it, I was like a stuffed turkey. But, I remember that her chappal broke and I said, oh, now what are we going to do? And she said, triumphantly, watch what I'm going to do. And I emptied the contents of her bag on the bed in the hotel, and she was carrying glue. And within seconds, she had actually put her chappal together.